in 2020, I wrote an article about the petrodollar system,
Hmm.
and one of the things I highlighted was that China. So the way it historically worked, the petrodollar system is that the United States runs these big trade deficits.
Hmm.
We send out dollars, we get goods and services, and then those countries take their dollars and then they buy treasuries with they recycle them into treasuries, so they finance our deficit spending. And starting in 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative, what China started to do is they said, okay, we're going to keep running those surpluses with the United States, but then instead of buying treasuries, we're going to start making loans to African nations, to Southeast Asian nations, to Latin American nations. And we're going to start, basically getting all sorts of commodity rights and infrastructure rights and partnerships to build refineries and things like that. And so they kind of actually, it's sort of like a neo-colonialist financing thing, similar to what Europe does, similar to what the United States does. China started to play that game, but instead of doing it with their own currency, they were doing it with the dollar. It's almost like using the existing system against us. And so that's something I've been covering for quite a while, something that Luke Growen's been covering. And now it's getting a lot of action on the main stage with Zoltan covering. And of course, it's been accelerated
Yeah.
by, the invasion of Ukraine and then the associated seizures of funds. And then the whole kind of basically it pulled forward a lot of what I think was already happening. We're already in a path towards shifting from a unipolar financial system to a somewhat more multipolar system. And kind of like how remote work to some extent was always going to happen, but then lockdowns and COVID accelerate it. You take
Hmm.
what could have happened in 5 years and put it into 1 year. I think what could have happened in 10 years gets compressed into 3 years,
Hmm.
because of some of these recent events. And so I do think the world is more becoming multipolar in that sense. And I do think that a lot of commodities are encumbered in large part because some of these countries are taking their surpluses instead of buying treasuries, they're buying what they perceive as far more valuable, which is the underlying commodities, the underlying infrastructure, transportation infrastructure to get those commodities to them, that sort of thing. And so I do think that's going to be an inflationary pressure as we go deeper into this decade.
And is that essentially what commodity encumbrance refers to? Sort of the rights, the ability to take the possession essentially of commodity production? Is that what it refers to?
Yeah, let's say, for example, China goes to Ecuador and says, "Hey, I see you're having a problem with your currency. You're having trouble raising debt. We can go ahead and we'll loan you that, and we'll give you a decent interest rate. But we're going to get 80% of your future oil production for the next 10 years, or we're going to partner with you. We're going to build some refineries. But then the thing is that we get right of first refusal on 80% of your output."
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so you can look at when you kind of look at the whole world, how much oil does the world produce? How much do we use? And what is the marginal difference? It becomes more complicated because then you have to say, okay, well, how much of that is already fully accounted for? If Ecuador doubles its oil supply, and I'm just using them as an example, but if they double their oil supply, that's not necessarily oil that's available to the West. That could be already contractually obligated to go to China first, or at least give them right of first
Mm-hmm.
refusal. And so an increasing percentage of marginal commodity production out there is part of some of these longer term arrangements because that's where a lot of the financing has been going. It's kind of it's tied into that Belt and Road Initiative type of
Right.
global lending model. And so it's basically saying, okay, we'll lend you money. Sometimes it's just as simple as you pay us back interest, but other times it's okay if you have trouble paying interest, we'll either get the asset or we'll get rights of future production from that asset. And so basically those commodities become increasingly encumbered, which
Mm-hmm.
means somebody already has they're already owed to somebody.
Right. And China's getting oil and liquid natural gas at a steep discount. And now they're paying in different currencies. Now they're not paying in the dollar, they're paying in the yuan. But now also that is backed by gold, is it not? So we're really seeing global currency shifts that ultimately threaten US global dollar dominance, right?
Yeah, so China for a while has been wanting to buy energy and commodities in its own currency. Certainly, the seizure and sanction of Russian funds gives China more leverage there because they can go over and say, "Hey, I see you have a problem there. We still want to buy your
Yep.
stuff, but we're going to do it in yuan, and you can't really, you're not really much in a negotiating position." Same thing with India. Actually, India says, "Okay, we're going to keep buying all this stuff, and we can look into buying with some of our own currencies now." And making kind of deals like that. And so this again is like an acceleration of trends that were already underway. In
Yeah.
some sense, the way that I go back and phrase it is that after World War II, the United States was over 40% of global GDP. We were like most other countries were devastated. We were mostly untouched. And so we could set the rules
Right.
and build this more unipolar system. Then during the Cold War, Soviets tried to somewhat counter it. They didn't have the population, they didn't have the scale, they didn't have the governance model to fully compete with it. So that collapsed. Kind of resumed that unipolar system in the 90s, the 2000s. But with the rise of China, the rise of India,
Yeah.
the rise of the euro, you've had this more multipolar system, which is actually a more natural system. I mean, the United States is less than 5% of the global population. We're now down to something like 20% of global GDP, depending on how you measure it. And so we're just not big enough to be like the only, currency that all energy is priced in, for example. It's just not tenable. And then ironically, it's not even good for us anymore because it's really hard to make things here if we
Right.
have a currency that's artificially strong. So it's good to have a strong currency, but it's not good to have an artificially strong currency due to like weird policies. And so basically, and actually that's where I would agree with Luke Groman that he's made the assertion that the whole petrodollar system made sense for like the first 20 years of its existence, like
Right.
during the Cold War. But then once the Soviet Union fell in the 90s, some of these systems should have been shifted earlier and they weren't. And so now some of the same things that used to give the United States a lot of strength, a lot of this dollar hegemony, actually kind of comes back to bite us
Hmm.
ever since that time. And so I do think that dollar hegemony is under attack, really.
Hmm.
But I think it's natural for that to happen. And I think in the long run, the United States, even the current system is bad for the United States, ironically. But of course, it depends on who you ask. It's good for the
Right.
military industrial complex, but
Right.
it's bad for people that actually want to make things in the United States.
Right. Bad for the middle class, but it's been good for the people who carry assets.